Today, on Energy Contact, do you think you're sexy? Well, whether you do or not, you're about to understand that your sexual energy is not what you always thought it was. So think again. In order to understand ourselves, we have to understand ourselves energetically. And in order to do that, we have to understand our sexual energy. So put off that cold shower for a half an hour or so and pull up a chair, because we're going to get a more intimate understanding of all this right now on Energy Contact. Hello, and welcome to Energy Contact. My name is Joseph Willenbrink. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you to the production staff here in the studio for helping me get my message out to you. Energy Contact is a series I'm presenting to you as a public service. It's about attaining perfect health, growth, self-improvement, happiness, and realizing your full potential. It's designed to present you a new way of seeing yourself, and a new way of seeing the world around you. We're talking about things that have to do with making an energetic contact with yourself internally and with your environment. There's no difference between the body, the mind, the spirit, the emotion, the intellect, the ego. There's no difference between mass and energy. These things are all exactly the same. There is something about us that likes to categorize, classify, separate, parse these things out. Take one little cell out of something, look at it under a microscope, and think we understand it all. But in fact, all that health and self-improvement we're talking about take place when we do just the opposite. It happens when we put these things together, when we make an energetic contact between the physical world and the unseen one. We're presenting on these programs a brand new paradigm that's thousands of years old. We're presenting extraordinary topics for ordinary people. And let's move right ahead with that. Let's bring up our first slide. Everyone please understand that I am not a doctor. This show is not a medical show, medical advice show, medical talk show, medical help show, anything like that. It could not be further from it. I might call myself an energy healer or chakra healer, things like that. So might a lot of other people. But state, federal, and local governments absolutely do not. They call me no such thing, and it's important to understand that. There's a lot of important information on your screen right now. Please read all of that, if you will, with your full attention. But when you've got it down, now would be a great time to locate a pencil and paper. Now here's why you want to do that. At the end of this program, we're going to run some credits. And on those credits, there's going to be contact information for me. Now I invite and encourage you to contact me. I'm sort of hoping that something I have to say to you today might inspire you to want to do that. But in order to contact me, you're going to need that contact information. In order to get it, you're going to have a pencil and paper handy. There'll be plenty of time to jot that stuff down later if that pencil's ready. So please locate that now. All right, let's come back up here. Today is episode number 14 of Energy Contact. And if you're tuning in for the first time today, well, thanks. Thanks and welcome. These shows are sequential. They build. So we're talking about things today that we've introduced and explained, defined previously. There's some ramp-up stuff, some up-to-speed things that you will have missed out on. However, I do my very best to make sure that every program has a lot of value on a standalone basis. So you'll get plenty out of today's show just all by itself. However, if what you see piques your interest, well then I'll invite and encourage you to look around, because there will be earlier programs airing at later times. They'll either be re-airing right here on this station, or they'll be on at different days in different areas. And if you look for them, I'll appreciate it. All right, and now it's time for me to introduce my co-host to you. Here's my buddy Slim. And Slim is here for a reason, besides just my moral support. Since we're investigating what it is that energy contacts in the physical self, we have to understand a couple of things. We have to understand something about energy, and this is a program all about energy. That's what we're talking about. But all of that energy out there somewhere does us no good. It does us no good whatsoever until we bring it into focus, until we bring it into contact with something. My pal Slim here is here to help us understand what that thing is that the energy contacts. Remember, a body without energy is just a corpse. And energy without a body, well, it might be a number of cool things, but none of them are human. Okay, previously on Energy Contact, we have been looking at the body intellect, haven't we? The body intellect and the anatomy that it builds, how thought builds anatomy. You started at conception as one cell, one single cell that divided into two identical cells. And each of those cells divided into identical cells, and each of those, and so on and so forth. Of all those identical cells, some went to your brain, some went to your belly, some went to your toes. Identical cells, same information, different places. So we've seen how those materials that we were always told were brain things, those things that give us thought, reason, recall, memory, logic, intelligence, all those effectors and receptors and gears and gizmos and things like that. In fact, they are in every cell of our body. They permeate every cell of us. We've seen that we are made of atoms that are all identical. One carbon atom is the same as any other. And cells that are all individual, like snowflakes. But those atoms, and therefore the cells that they build, and therefore you and I, are mostly holes. We're mostly empty space, mostly nothing. In like manner, we've seen that we all have instincts that are all exactly the same, and reactions to those instincts, the things we do with them, that are all very different. We've seen that while these instincts and reactions are all invisible concepts, they manifest themselves into our physical anatomy. They build us. And in the process of all that, we've seen a little bit of what life is all about, what it means to be alive, what makes life. And we've seen that life occurs within a series of forces. Internal ones, the forces that animate us, frequency, rhythm, vibration, pulse, breath. And external ones that push and pull us around, the bumps and bruises, the kisses and the hugs of life. We've seen in particular that breath is our most basic need and that survival is our most primal instinct. And they're both based in our core, in our abdomen. Now, through all of these things that we've been looking at, and in conjunction with that body intellect, we set up our strengths and weaknesses. So 1 million different people will respond to the same hug or the same bump in 1 million different ways. We've been talking about primal things, instinctual things, and we've observed what they have to do with our core. Core thoughts, core actions, core values, core feelings, core instincts, core everything. And that brings us to today. Today, we're going to look at sex and sexuality, at sexual energy. But today's sex talk will be different than any one you've ever heard before. Now, today's program is strictly rated TVG. But if you have kids in the room, they might start asking questions about you, about these things, and depending on your mindset, that could be either a good thing or a bad thing. So you've been noticed, and conduct yourselves accordingly. We want to understand today the anatomy of our sexuality, the physical anatomy of it, what shapes our bodies, the part of it that shapes our bodies. We want to understand a few other things too. We want to know, why is sex so hysteria-invoking? What's the big deal? What's healthy sexuality? How can we access the healing power of our sexual energy and channel it so that we can turn it into our good health? And when and how can our sexual energy make us sick? We want to know what our sexual energy says about us and what we can do about it. And that's what we're talking about today. But first, we've reached the part of our program where we get to take a break for a second. We've arrived at the point of the program where we get to take our virtual field trip, our journey in our mind's eye. And for today's visualization, we're going to take a mystical, magical, mental journey back through space and time. And we're going to land in the woods in India about 8,000 years ago. And we're in the middle of nowhere. And it's very quiet. So we have to be quiet, because over there's a Swami meditating in the woods, very peacefully. He's serene, and he's not really doing anything but just sitting there, best we can tell. So why are we here? Why are we interested in that? Because that fellow knows everything there is to know about his sexual energy. He knows more about his sexual energy than you know about yours. But here's the catch. That fellow is maybe 90 years old, and he's celibate. He's a virgin, in fact. Hold that thought. If survival is our most basic need, then our sexuality runs a pretty close second. And your sexuality is your only basic instinct that you have installed in you that you can't discuss at a luncheon with a few casual acquaintances. It's more private than that. And it is certainly more hysteria-invoking. It flabbergasts us. It makes us gasp. We learn about sex as the birds and the bees without understanding the nature and the power of this energy other than as a mating ritual tool or as arousal and gratification followed by guilt and remorse. We think of the people we objectify as life support systems for their reproductive organs, don't we? Now this frenzy over our own bodies and the bodies of others messes us up, and it makes us sick, like we have an addiction that can only be satisfied for a moment, like a constant recurring itch. And it prevents us from healing ourselves. It keeps us from growth, health, happiness, self-improvement, and the realization of our full potential. And yet, we continue indulging it. But sexuality is really just one application of a basic primal instinct in us. It's not the survival instinct, or is it? In an energy contact universe, all of these distinctions sort of blur a little bit. But if it's not survival, it's at least as much a part of us. For this program, we're going to give it a new name. We're going to call it Kundalini. Now this Kundalini is not about your intimate life, your romance, or your mojo, or anything like that. However, if you don't understand Kundalini at some instinctive level, your sex life will probably be suboptimal. If you think it's suboptimal now, stay tuned. But before we go into the intricacies of Kundalini energy today, we want to take what will seem at first like a quantum leap to you. We're going to investigate another subject that has a name that scares people, mysticism. We'll see in a moment that they are intimately connected. Why do mystics have their wacky reputations? Well, it's because mystics are very powerful, and they're different. Why is that? Well, at least partially because they understand their sexual energy. Well, why is that? Well, at least partially because they aren't hysterical. But that in no way implies that they're promiscuous. They might be like our Swami meditating in the woods. Now, there have always been people who criticize these mystics, and that's exactly the insinuation that they make, that there's some sort of sexual depravity, some sort of promiscuity going on. And by the way, there's plenty of modern-day mystics too, but we're going back and looking at them historically a little bit for right now. Now, back in the day, so-called decent folks, religious folks, would go out and spy on the pagans, as they called them, and those spies would see people out somewhere in the middle of nowhere, dancing around under the light of the full moon, probably naked. And these viewers, viewing them through their sort of jaded and limited filters, they'd just assume that they were having some sort of orgy or something going on. Organized religion has always been at odds with people who have an interest in opening up the energy in their hips. What's up with that? Well, hang on. You see, those dancing pagans, they weren't doing anything wrong at all. In fact, they were doing something right. They understood that there was a powerful energy located at a physical location in their hips. They understood energy contact and that you need to do physical activities to loosen and move energetic things and vice versa. They understood Kundalini. And they knew that in order to wield this power, in order to master it, that energy has to be broken loose and brought up so that it could move unimpeded through physical mass. Now here's something very interesting. Mystics from all over the world were basically doing the same thing. Now, this was back in the day before communication and travel, so they weren't learning it from each other. It must have all come from some same central source somewhere. Indians, Celts, Africans, Chinese, Hebrews, Native Americans, up to the time of the early Christians, it was all the same. All of them were dedicating themselves to liberating trapped Kundalini energy into mastering their sexual energy. And it was a very spiritual pursuit. All right, hang on, let's change gears again. Keep in mind that we're looking at how hysteria and judgment disempower us. Let's go back to your childhood. One day when you were about 1 year old and you were toddling about the house in your diaper. Well, that diaper was soiled and your hand went down into that diaper, and about that time your mother looked around and she gasped and honey, that's dirty, that's nasty. She hustled you into the bathroom, she washed your hands and changed you, all the time in sort of a frenzy about it all. And about that time you were thinking, oh, wait a minute. Mama always tells me I've got such pretty little eyes and a cute little smile. She tells me about my pretty little fingers and my pretty little toes. God made a mistake. He made a bad part. He made a nasty part, and it's right in the middle of my core. I better shut that down. Well, congratulations. Now your disempowerment has begun. But hang on, it doesn't stop there. Fast forward about 10 years, and you were learning that this area of you is nasty and dirty for a whole new set of reasons. And by the time you got to puberty, you were traumatized by it all. And you know what? More than likely, you still are. Well, God doesn't make bad parts and He doesn't make mistakes. So why are people telling you that? Let's go back to the mystics. They knew that their pelvises held their core, and that was the key to their power. The mystics empowered themselves. They didn't sabotage themselves with body shame and things like that. They didn't see their anatomy as dirty or nasty, not any part of it. And the same holds true for mystics today. So we want to take that information and investigate the anatomy of sexuality. Like every other energetic thing anywhere, sexual energy has a physical presence. Now, a couple of shows ago, we discussed breath. Remember that? And we discovered our psoas muscle. Then we looked at our core, and we saw our psoas muscle. After that, we examined our basic muscle of support for our entire body, and we found out that it was the psoas muscle. And then last time, we looked at the main muscle of courage and fear and survival, things like that. And guess what? It was the psoas. Well, today, we're not really interested so much in our breath or our core or our structure or our survival. We're looking at sexual energy today. So bring up our slide and you will see that today we're looking at our psoas. Fancy that. That's your psoas muscle on your screen there and your pelvis on the other side. Note the spelling. I put that up there in case you want to research it later. Now that psoas muscle does all of the following and more. It flexes and releases the hip and thigh towards the abdomen, or the abdomen towards the hip and thigh, depending on which way you're going. It controls spine position and balance. It armors and protects the tender abdominal organs. It controls breathing by passing through the diaphragm. And it controls everything from structure to bladder control to sexuality and more by passing through the muscles of the pelvic floor. That psoas muscle on your screen there is about the most important thing in your body. You can't do much without it. You can't walk, stand, sit up, poo, lift, protect yourself, breathe, or process sexual energy. Of our 630 some odd muscles, it is the only one of consequence that connects the top of us to the bottom of us. A few shows ago, we saw that the psoas muscle goes through 3 body sections. Let's move forward to our next slide, and you'll see a view of the middle one, the abdominal cavity. You can see the psoas here too. It's in the middle there, along with a bunch of other stuff. Now, can you see, just from looking at this screen, perhaps you can get a feel of how important that core is to you. Do you really want to ignore that or disempower it? Do you want to call it dirty and pretend it's not there? I don't think so. In fact, I submit that you want to do just the opposite. But let's look at some other things on your screen before we move on. You can see that the diaphragm, that's the horizontal thing on the top there, constitutes the roof of your abdominal cavity, and the muscles of your pelvic floor down below comprise the base of it. These two things together are what border your abdominal cavity. That diaphragm up top controls breathing, your most important need. But those pelvic floor muscles are very, very important. Those are the muscles of the pelvic urogenital diaphragm, the muscles of the perineum. And they are really the muscles of structure, of bladder and bowel control, and of sexuality. But they are empowered by the psoas. All right, let's come back up here. That psoas gives structure to our instincts. It gives anatomy to our instincts. And it makes you sexy. Or not. A functional psoas muscle facilitates the upward flow of Kundalini energy and holds your pelvis and core so they can facilitate that flow too. A closed off and unhealthy psoas stops energy flow of all kinds, just whatever. So there is a range of sexual function. There's a spectrum, and we wear that on our bodies. And most of us are somewhere on the middle of a big continuum. But even so, we can learn about ourselves by looking at the extremes. So we're going to do that now. Some people suffer from sexual diarrhea, and others suffer from sexual constipation, pardon the analogy. In other words, there's a scale, and at one extreme is overactive sexuality, promiscuity, acting out, being loose, whatever you call it. At the other extreme is the complete absence of sexual energy flow, all the uptight stuff, frigidity, impotence, things like that. Now, 1 million different people will have 1 million different optimal balance points. There's no one ideal point. There's only an ideal point for you. But we want to understand this by looking at the extremes. So let's bring up a slide and we'll visit an old friend. Remember this fellow here? We can look at this fellow and tell that he is not a sex machine. How do we know? Well, because sexual energy requires a little hip pivot, a little booty motion, and this dude ain't got it. And he ain't going to get it either unless he makes some major changes. His psoas is just too tight. The rest of him is too. If you've ever seen a fellow like this on the dance floor, it's not a pretty sight. And it's not that this guy can't be attractive, but whatever it is that's attractive about him, it's not his animal passion, it's not his animal magnetism. This fellow's all up in his head. Now, in extreme cases, this can be the build of a fellow who visits prostitutes and brothels and strip joints because he's so bound up that he can't function around people he cares about. And in very extreme cases, this can be the build of a fellow who is sexually abusive, whose only real sexual outlet is through venting hostility. Let's move right to our next slide. Remember this woman here? She is Rigid Man's polar opposite. We'll call her Duck Butt Woman. And you can tell that she's putting her sexuality out there. Judge if you will, but unlike our friend, this woman can dance. Now, in extreme cases, this is the woman who walks on the crowded Venice Beach sidewalk in a thong bikini and complains about how come everybody just wants to look at her rear end. She uses her sexuality to attract people so she can reject them, or so that she can complain to them or about them and get attention, so she can complain about that too. And while her sexuality is running wild, it's not fulfilling to her. She's sexually frustrated and she's bitter about it. And she blames you, regardless of who you are, how old you are, what gender you are, or if she's ever met you. She's just angry. She sexualizes the intentions of others. She sees, "Excuse me, do you know what time it is?" as a pickup line. And in more extreme cases, this can be the woman who that guy on the last slide visits in the brothel or in the strip joint, because she's using her broken sexuality in an attempt to regain her control over men. All right, let's come back up here. Remember, the goal is not to look at people's butts and be judgmental about them. The goal is to understand that energy has an anatomy, and that anatomy says something about energy. Your anatomy says something about your energy. Rigid Man and Duck Butt Woman are caricatures. They define a range. And while we can learn something by observing them, your real assignment is to go in the mirror and look at yourself. When people's sexual energy gets bound up, or scrambled up, or whatever it does, all sorts of things go wrong. Things that have nothing to do with what you have traditionally thought were sexual energy things. And other things that do. And it's going to be hard to help all these people. It's going to be hard to change Rigid Man and Duck Butt Woman because they're all bound up. Literally, they're bound up by anger and rigidity and cynicism and hysteria. And their doctor or their shrink cannot figure it out. He'll call it a lifestyle choice. All right, but if you think about it, everybody, almost everybody has sexual energy related illnesses. Not just our extreme examples, but everybody. Every woman you know has or has had bladder infections or yeast infections, intestinal problems or ovarian cysts, scary pap smears, uterine problems, sexual function problems, all sorts of things like that. And every man eventually gets prostate problems, and he's got bladder and intestinal problems of his own. I've heard medical doctors say that every man who lives long enough will get prostate cancer, which means that every man that you see over the age of 85 years old or thereabouts has some prostate cancer, 100%. And by the way, all those obnoxious male function ads that you see on TV, that's become a gazillion-dollar industry like that. So there's something going on. So you see, male or female, everybody gets these maladies and everybody seems to accept that they're supposed to. What's up with that? I mean, not everybody gets shoulder pains or ankle pains, things like that. Why does everyone have a problem in their core? Some will contend to you that it's because this area is poorly engineered or too delicate. I don't think so. I don't think the universe made a mistake when he made you. It's not the design of the machine, it's how you're operating it. And that is because of hysteria, which makes you clench up that area like a fist. All right, so we've seen some things wrong with sexuality, but what's right with it? What's the purpose of it, other than the obvious? Well, Kundalini energy is our power. It's animus, it's drive and dynamism. It's the power and motivation you need to survive, to breathe, to structure yourself. It's even good luck, it's charisma, things like that. And you are disempowered without it. And it's the power to attract healthy relationships with healthy and available people. All of this stuff is one reason why sexual abuse is so disempowering. People who are sexy live longer and happier and healthier lives. But remember, we're talking sexy the way the old Swami in the woods knows it. So now you know that the path to enlightenment goes through some places that you may have thought unlikely before. Most religions will tell you just the opposite. And now you know why so few are enlightened, even though so many are religious. All right, let's return to that Swami in the woods for a second. How can he be so sexy and so sexless both at the same time? Well, it's because he's learned to do what that energy, he's learned what it's there for. And in doing so, he creates balance and liberates himself from his animal self. He becomes more godlike. He's not crippled and disabled by fear and body image and hysteria and religious legalism and things like that. He can breathe. He's properly structured. Don't you want to be like that? You can be like that too. Do you have to be sexless like our Swami to find that stuff? Of course not. You just have to get over the hysteria and find balance. You have to figure out what to do with your sexual energy. That sounds simple, but it's easy to do once you're aware. And now you are. And that's all the time we have today. Until next time, thank you for joining me. I wish you peace and positive energy and a healthy life in Energy Contact.
Drive away all these doubts I've been keeping it out. Keep my mind on better things. Just keep my mind on better things. Just keep my mind on better things.